In the know.
Good evening, everyone.
In the know.
Tony Reeves, fire. Following the news in any way, shape, or form. No shortage of things to talk about. What does it mean? What will it bring? This is a reality we simply have to accept. Tony Reeves, fire. Tony Reeves. Let's go ahead and get started.
Hey. Thank you very much. And as always, welcome to another edition of In the Know. I am your host, Tony Reeves. Let's get cracking, as I like to say. For those of you, we want to talk about how this one thing that I've mentioned to people before. I said the manufacturing industry is probably not going to come back in the way that you think. And I've had this discussion with people, and I have to kind of hit that. Oops, sorry about that. I kind of have to hit this up in a particular way so that it makes some sense. Several years ago, when I was almost 20 years ago, back when I was coming out of graduate school, more than 20, back in the early mid-90s, I remember I had this hard conversation with one of my fraternity brothers. He was in the process of applying to law school. I was in the middle of getting ready to go to graduate school, and so we were talking about a few things. And I made the comment to him that I said, we are in a unique situation because we know the change is coming. And he's like, well, what do you mean by that? I said, I think it's safe for us to say that we will probably not be able to work in the same capacity that our parents did. And you're like, what do you mean by that? And he was like, we're probably not going to be able to work a job and work 20 years and ride off into the sunset. And when I said that, he stopped and he was like, you are completely right. And when I said that, I wasn't saying it to disparage my parents' industry or disparage the way we are to say, we don't have that level of discipline. We can't work like that. No, we have to stop and think about what our parents' generation was like in terms of what was going on at the time. I'm a Generation X. So that means I was born in, the window is 69 to 80. I was born in 65 to 80. I was born in 69. If you stop and you think about my mom's generation, she's a baby boomer, which is 46 to 64. What was their life like? You figure World War II was over, I think 45, so I think if I remember correctly. Think about what the world was like at that time. Most of your industrialized countries were devastated as a result of the war, whether it be Africa, whether it be Eastern Europe, Western Europe, portions of Asia. You got to remember, you had the Nazis dealing with in Europe and going into portions of Asia in terms of Russia, and then you have the Japanese Empire that was Asia, China, and all those aspects. So you're talking about, with the exception of Pearl Harbor, and I'm not sure about South America. I've never really investigated, so I may be wrong, so correct me if you can. But if you stop and you think about it, the Americas were fairly untouched from the atrocities of war. So most of World War II impacted Asia and Europe and Africa. So by the time we came off the end of the war, we had put this awesome manufacturing machine into place in order to create all these planes and ships and weapons and tanks and so forth. So guess what happened? Well, as soon as the war was over, two things you have to keep in mind. And again, go speak to historians. They'll be more than happy to clarify. You had two things going on. One, we had a manufacturing machine like no other. That now, instead of making weapons of mass destruction, it can now switch to making things that can globally benefit a decimated society, a whole. So that's one thing. Two, again, we were probably the only show in town. Now, some people are going to comment and say, well, we weren't only. I say, but no, the reality is that, think about it. Most of the major industries in your industrialized countries, especially in Africa, Asia, and Europe, were decimated from that period of war. And remember, Europe just went through two wars. So it was like World War I, 1917, World War II in 1940s. So they had two wars that decimated their entire area. So now what happens is that you've got countries that are in the process of rebuilding. You've got countries that are in the process of trying to reestablish themselves. They are in desperate need of resources. And guess who is still standing with their heads held high? The United States. So we had the ability to crank out things and that other nations and our own nation could utilize in manners that were spectacular. And that was pretty much after the World War. So guess what? My mom's in 46. The peak period of time, you probably would argue, and I've read different reports about this, and so please forgive me if I can't readily recount them. But you have to think about the fact that probably the peak time period, probably in the 60s and the 70s. Think about it. So you've got two things happening. One, you've got a large number of veterans who are coming back. So that's one. Two, you've now got a diversified workforce. Now, don't get me wrong, because women were treated horribly during this time when a lot of these service members came back. But the problem is now is that you have, and it's a good problem to have, you've got women who are trained to do things that men can do. And so now you've got a deep workforce from that particular standpoint. But I'm again say, women they had to do a lot of fighting during that time period, because remember now we're rolling into the 60s and we're starting to talk about the women's rights movement, civil rights movement, gay rights movement, peace movement, all those things were happening. But I'm talking about purely from a worker standpoint, from a manufacturing standpoint. We were probably at our peak around 60s and the 70s. If I remember correctly from some of my research, they talked about, I think they said the height of the union era was like in the 70s, which would make sense because at that particular point, you were at the height of your manufacturing. Countries were kind of still getting their legs underneath us, but we were the only show in town, which then brings me to what happens after that. Well, guess what? By the time my generation is born, and we're starting to enter into the workforce. So let's take for instance, so you're talking about 65. By the time they're hit about, you say 65, you're talking maybe about 90, about 83. Around 83, 84, we're turning 18 years old, going into the workforce. Most of the world has kind of got back on its feet. So at this particular point, we are almost knocking on 40 plus years removed from the last World War. And so you're now seeing a decrease in demand. And I really would love to speak to some of my supply and demand or supply chain historians out there who could talk about what it meant for us to go through this period of peace. Yes, there was a Cold War. Yes, there was Vietnam. Yes, there was a Korean War. And yes, you did. But we literally went through a 40-year window of having no world war. And so now what ends up happening? You start finding yourself in a position where the demand for the things that we used to do are no longer there. And not only is the demand no longer there, there are opportunities to move, opportunities to move the ability to generate those things to other countries. And two, technology has forced us to reevaluate how to do those things. Think about it. When we started seeing robotics entering into the manufacturing industry, guess what? A lot of the things that we relied upon people to do by hand, we didn't have to rely upon. So now you've got to change in terms of what types of work that needs to be done and what can be done. Why is that important? Because I often tell people, be very careful when people are communicated to you that they're going to bring manufacturing jobs back. I'm like, my first thinking, I'm always like, when they say that, what type of jobs are we talking about? If they're talking about bringing back manufacturing, and I hate to say bringing back, because to me, bringing back implies bringing something that's old, that's antiquated, that's no longer being utilized. I would much rather say that we're going to bring manufacturing jobs, but the jobs that we're going to bring are going to force you to have to adapt your skill sets to the jobs that are going to be required to be done now. Why is that important? Because if you have been trained to do something a particular way for a number of years, and then that industry moves, and then you're struggling for a couple of years to find something, and they're telling you, I'm going to bring the industry back. The problem that I have in that instance is that it's not being completely honest with you, because the reality is that if the job comes back, it's probably not going to come back in the same manner as it was when it left. So it's important for you to recognize that you need to adapt accordingly. And so that's what happens when you get new technology, new supply issues that pop up, new processes and procedures. And see, I often tell people, think about it. Think about how a car is made today. Whenever we see commercials, you know what we see? A lot of robotics. Guess what? For all those robotics that are doing work on the cars, at one point there were actually people. And so what do I mean so why am I stressing that? Because you need to recognize that when somebody says they're bringing back jobs, if they're not probably going to bring back the jobs that were done by hand, because they're now being done by robotics. The question you now have to ask yourself is that, Are they bringing jobs that I can do based on my skill set? And do I need to learn a new skill set in order to do the job? Again, when I say we're probably not going to do the same job for 20 years and ride out, I'm not implying that you can't find a job that you can work at for 20 years. I'm saying that we are working and living in a society where technology is coming in and adapting at such a remarkable pace that if you are not prepared to adapt to that change in such a way so that you can use your skill sets to satisfy whatever that employer needs, you're not going to be at that job very long. So if this job requires you to learn a particular set of skills that requires you to go back to school, to get some additional training, to move into a different arena and so forth, you better be prepared to do that, because the days of saying this job is being done this way and only going to be done this way, it's fast coming to an end. But I would also argue that it's probably never been like that to begin with. You've got to be careful. Because it's difficult for you in a position as an employee to try to compel an employer to basically stick to a process that allows you to have your job. If there are new processes and procedures that gives you the employer the ability to provide a service, update doing what they're doing in a more efficient manner, your responsibility is to figure out how you can be a part of that process. And if being a part of that process requires you to have to adapt, to learn, to train, and to educate yourself on something different from what you're doing, that's what you have to do in order to ensure that you can survive. And trust me, you've been doing it already. The struggle that a lot of people have is that if they've been doing things a certain way for such a long period of time, they may be a little resistant to that change. Stop being resistant. You've got the skills. Now you've just got to get the training so that you can ensure that you demonstrate to your employer or other employers that you have the ability to adapt to the ever-changing technology. So when somebody says they're going to bring back manufacturing, challenge them to say, are you bringing them back the way they were before with regards to our skill sets, and I don't have to learn anything new? Or are you bringing them here, and I need to get ready, and you need to get ready to show me what I need to do and put the resources in place so I can train accordingly to do these things so that when they come back, I'm ready and I'm not freaking out because I don't have the ability or the skills to do the job based on the manufacturing demands. All right, everyone. I want to thank you again for another edition of In the Know with Tony Reeves. As always, it's a wonder and a pleasure to have you here. You know, you can always leave me a comment, and as always, please give me a review. I'm always looking to improve, and I always can welcome your feedback. Again, my name is Tony Reeves, and as always, I'm going to end with my favorite question of the day. Are you ready for the Anthony Reeves experience?